And when we began to look in the late 90s at reporting of refugees and asylum seekers, it was very clear that the coverage was extremely damaging, largely because most journalists didn't know anything about the subject. They confused asylum with immigration. Some didn't know the difference between a Muslim and a Hindu, for instance. And they certainly didn't know who to talk to. So we set up this project which led in the end to the creation of the Exile Journalist Network, because we wanted to find people that journalists could understand. And we thought, what better people than to explain what's happening on the streets of Britain, but the journalists who've come here because they've been forced out of their country for doing their job. So it was quite a useful technique. To show you very quickly some headlines and make my main points at the end. Here's the sort of stories. This was a plan. After the cartoon controversy, one of the newspapers decided to see what their paper would look like if Muslims took over Britain. And luckily, the journalists stopped this being published. Here we have all the Eastern Europeans stealing benefits. Here's the huge numbers that are supposed to be coming over day after day after day. And there's a picture of a very unpopular woman there on the same page as the migrants and crime story. Here's the Christmas message. They've all come and taken our jobs. And then murderers, more jobs. Look at the figures. And this is one of the most recent ones, that having created a state of anxiety, which the government responds to by introducing new rules about citizenship, making people go through a ceremony to become citizens, and then realising that's not tight enough, so they change the rules on that, changing the law on immigration. You get these sorts of stories. It says now Muslims are demanding full introduction of Sharia law in Britain. It's a tiny little group of nutcases who have put out a press release, but it goes out on the front page of a national paper. And most of the other stories you've seen owe their origins to advocacy groups which are anti-immigration. And this is the main point that I want to make. Those people who are working with immigrants, for instance, or with minority communities, are so wrapped up with the enormity of their task that they tend to be reactive. Whereas some of these organisations, in Britain there's one called Migration Watch, which just spends its whole time churning out information which is recycled and recycled by the media, sets an agenda to which politicians respond, and out of the hysteria that's been built up over the last few years, we now have fascist parties representing parts of Britain in the European Parliament. We have the BBC feeling that it's got to do the right thing and allow them a platform on mainstream television. And just today and yesterday, you have the Prime Minister saying that the Socialist Party in Britain is going to tighten the rules even more on immigration, making immigration one of the big early election campaign issues. I'm just pointing out the power that the media has to construct the agenda, and the power that advocacy groups have to twist that agenda if they want to. But it's a much, much harder task than people imagine. It's not just down to the journalists, it's down to a whole sea change in the way people think about the use of the media. So I will end by just saying, as my little notes to journalists is, and to advocacy groups, is collect and disseminate reliable facts, so that journalists know where to go to get reliable facts, facts that have been checked and which are not pushing a particular line. Keep challenging stories. Many of those headline stories are completely untrue, but unless they get challenged and analysed, nobody will ever know. The point that's been made by our colleagues earlier about looking for a variety of voices, find ways of getting to know journalists so they know who to talk to. The human interest story, which I think is one of the most important points made earlier. And above all, we've got to insist as journalists that accuracy is important. One of the newspapers there, the journalists eventually took their editor to the regulator because he was twisting their stories to fit an agenda, because he knew that it was increasing the sales of his paper by 17% over a year. So in order to make his paper survive, he was twisting the editorial agenda, and the journalists...
You know, when I was kind of growing up as a journalist, making my bones as a journalist, there was a very sharp distinction between journalism as practiced, at least in the mainstream media, in the United States and in Europe. And in Europe, it's long been recognized that even mainstream leading newspapers have a voice and come from a point of view. Figaro, everybody knows what their politics is. Le Monde, everybody knows what their politics is. When I worked for the New York Times, we pretended we didn't have politics. I think the New York Times still thinks it doesn't have politics. I would argue that the New York Times now does have politics, but there's always been a sharp distinction in America, a sense that the mainstream media was impartial, that it was fact-finding, that it was nonpartisan, that it was independent, that it was a watchdog, and that it didn't come from someplace. Now, of course, that's eroded, eroded wildly in the last decade or so, where you get to the point where you have someone like Lou Dobbs on TV, and people are appalled by it, but not so appalled by it that, it took a long